How do you view the world? How does that inform the way you view yourself? My teen romantic comedy SNAFU is obsessed with these questions as it works to deconstruct romantic comedies. But to do that properly, you need to find something interesting to say about those broken pieces to justify pulling them apart. At its core, the story is about coming of age, challenging its characters by slowly breaking down the things they think are true. How do you build an identity? And what happens when the only lens through which you understand the world begins to fall apart? My teen romantic comedy SNAFU, or Yahare Ore no Seishun Robokome wa Machigate Iru, or just OreGairu, was written by Wataru Watari and follows Hachiman Hikigaya and his journey through the service club. Just so that we're all on the same page here, I'm gonna focus exclusively on the show. I've only read a bit of the light novels, and from what I did read, there was a lot of stuff that was cut out or condensed. That isn't inherently bad, it's just the nature of adaptations. But it does mean that there can be different interpretations of scenarios depending on the medium because of different contexts. So just keep that in mind. Now, a lot has already been said about Hachiman, and you know, I get it. His struggle is relatable to a lot of people, myself included. But here I want to focus on someone who I find a bit more relatable to me personally. Yukino. She is the polar opposite to Hachiman in a lot of ways. While the root of his problem revolves around his strong but flawed sense of self, that couldn't be further from the struggle Yukino faces. Before we get into what that is though, we need to talk about siblings are complicated. Hachiman describes them as your closest stranger, and that's a really good description. Everyone's family situation is different though, and those relationships can vary wildly. OreGairu has some pretty great depictions of them. Hachiman and Komachi, Saki and her siblings, and of course, Yukino and Haruno. The most basic reading of Yukino and Haruno's relationship would be that Yukino constantly lives in her sister's shadow. We see that when Meguri asks Yukino to be the culture festival chairperson. There can be certain expectations when you're a younger sister or brother, especially if you're close in age to your sibling and they're good at a lot of the things that they do. An expectation to do the things that they did. This isn't malicious or anything, it's just something that people tend to do, and you can't really get around that. But you can imagine that this might have happened to Yukino a lot throughout her life, considering that they're only 3 years apart and that Haruno was involved in a lot of different things. Over time, Yukino would build an identity around being like her sister, and her arc would involve learning to step out of Haruno's shadow. But this isn't exactly what's happening. The moment Yukino stops trying to chase after her sister, her problems only get worse. And I think that speaks to an understanding of how these kinds of relationships can play out. For people on the outside, it can look like it's a matter of the younger sibling trying to compete with the older, but that's not always true. The goal of the identity Yukino has created for herself is not to challenge Haruno. Yukino has already resigned herself to the idea that Haruno is better in every conceivable way. Yukino was given a life of freedom by her parents that wasn't really free, because instead of giving her a goal, all she was given were limitations. And so put into a situation where she didn't know what to do, Yukino did the only thing she could. She turned to Haruno, not as a figure for guidance, but as a means to dictate her life. This is the identity Yukino Yukinoshita has created, one that is entirely dependent on somebody else. Yukino is very talented. She is smart, straightforward, but only because she is incredibly efficient at conforming to this mask. But that efficiency comes at a cost. As long as she holds on to this identity, it will continue to strip everything away. No matter what Yukino does, it will never be enough. If she fails at what she's doing, it's because she's lacking. But more importantly, even if she manages to accomplish something great, even if it surpasses what Haruno did, it will never be a testament of her own merits. Because in Yukino's mind, she was only doing what someone else had done before. It's an identity that makes Yukino take all of the blame and none of the credit. Follow this line of thinking and you arrive at how Yukino views herself. Everything she gains is not the result of her own efforts. People are only friends with the parts of her that are a shallow imitation of someone else. And she fears that the moment she tries to take off this mask, it will expose her for what she really is. someone playing pretend. It's this fear that makes changing this identity so difficult, and it becomes so deeply entwined with how people view themselves that they can still play into this mask even when they actively try to work against it. Let's talk about one of the most discussed questions in the show. Did Yukino want to be the student council president? Something Haruno never was. To me, the answer is yes, kind of. But here's the important part. Even if Yukino did, even if she took on that role, it would not have solved her problems. She would still end up in exactly the same place as she does in the show. And if anything, her eventual breakdown would have happened even faster. The identity Yukino has created does not aim to be better than anyone. Its sole purpose is to use someone else to dictate choices in her life. In that moment, it may have been something Yukino wanted to do to set herself apart, but it wasn't what she needed. It was a decision built around the idea that she might gain something Haruno didn't have. But that's still a choice that relies on someone else. If Haruno was not around, and if Yukino was put into the same position, would she still have made that choice? I don't really know, and that uncertainty puts into question her motivations. The fact that the answer to that question is unclear when Haruno is taken out of the picture means that Yukino is still relying on someone else to choose. Of course, this wasn't the only reason why she made that decision. A lot of other factors were at play too, and it also doesn't mean that she wouldn't be a good president. She certainly could be in the future. I mainly want to focus on this specific element because it speaks to the fact that even if Yukino went through with this plan at this point in her life, it would not have addressed the root of her problems, and it would have left her ill-equipped to deal with what happens next. If she became student council president then and there, Yukino would no longer be able to rely on this identity to make choices. And because it is so incredibly efficient at trying to achieve one specific goal, any deviations will inevitably lead to a complete breakdown. I find it fitting that throughout the show, one of her most prominently featured talents is baking, a skill that requires you to precisely follow instructions, but put Yukino in a situation where she cannot follow a set path, and she has absolutely no sense of direction. It can be tempting for Yukino to be content with no longer relying on Haruno to make decisions, but that just isn't enough. The position Haruno holds in Yukino's life will just be filled by someone else. While Hachiman's problem stems from his strong but flawed sense of self, Yukino's problem stems from the fact that she has absolutely no sense of self. Separating yourself from this identity is difficult. It requires you to make decisions in a way that you never did before, and you have to come to terms with the fact that no one holds all the answers. Beneath the facade of people who seem to know what they're doing are individuals who struggle and anguish over their decisions, attempting to find their own place in the world. When I watch this show, when I see this story play out, I relate to Yukino the most because I see a snapshot of the person I used to be, struggling to find an identity outside of my older brother. While her situation is different than mine, the journey she goes through is one that I intimately relate to. Throughout the show, we see just how ill-equipped Yukino is at dealing with times where the identity she has created isn't useful. She runs from conversations that turn towards her, and if she does talk about herself, most of the time she will bring up someone else to compare herself to, because it's the only way she knows how to understand the world. Yukino can't process situations that require self-reflection, and the moment she can no longer use that identity to make choices in life, it leaves her paralyzed, because making decisions for her own sake is something she doesn't know how to do. Yukino's journey is one where she needs to overcome the fear of not knowing what course of action is right, and to learn how to define herself in terms outside of someone else's presence. The characters in this show are complex, the relationships are messy, and the story isn't afraid to leave you behind if you're not paying attention. It's one of the things I love about the show. There are a lot of details you can pick up by watching and listening closely. Hachiman doesn't question the fact that Yui picks up on a lot of his mannerisms when he thinks no one pays attention to him. Hayato can spell and say Hachiman's name correctly, but consciously chooses not to. Yui was very clearly listening in on Yukino and Hachiman's conversation in the nurse's office. Yukino grabs the picture of her and Hachiman together at Destinyland when he's not around, something that doesn't get brought up again until much later. These are tiny moments that flesh out all of the characters. There are enough details here to give a rough sketch of the dynamics and motivations of everyone in the show, but enough ambiguity to leave room for us to fill in the gaps. And that's the beauty in a story like this. What you get out of it depends heavily on what you bring in. You might not have had the same emotional connection to these characters like I did, and that's fine. I'm willing to admit that a lot of what I see in Yukino is projection from my own past experiences. There are a lot of different ways you can interpret the characters and their journeys. I'm not sure how much of this can be attributed to Wataru or the talented directors and writers who worked to adapt this story, but I'm glad it exists in the way it does. It's comforting when you can see your struggles put into a context that you can understand and digest. It's through these moments in media that we might be able to get catharsis and find something genuine. Thank you for watching. I put a lot of effort into this one, so I hope it shows. I also got a lot of feedback and comments on my last video, which I do read. Thank you. I am very sorry that I said Subaru Nagatsuki instead of Subaru Natsuki. That was my bad. But I also got a lot of comments on how I say Beetlejuice. I guess some people didn't know that it's one way you can say the name of that star. You can look it up, it's the way I learned to say it. To be fair though, I actually should have said Beetlejuice or Petaljuice. But anyways, thank you again for all the support.